I know.
Hi, Tom. Looking forward to this. This is going to be the best presentation all year.
Thank you. You obviously haven't seen me present before, Murray.
Yeah, but the project speaks for itself.
Oh, it does, absolutely.
Hey, Tom, I hear that you're retiring from the DHB.
I am indeed on Friday.
Oh my God, what are you going to do with yourself?
Well, I'm going to take a couple of years off. Oh, hello, Yvonne.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
So I've got to finish my PhD first before the end of the year. And then, of course, the plan was to travel, but that's somewhat limited these days.
Yes.
But I'm going to go down to the South Island and enjoy that. And
Prolonged sabbatical then. Good on you.
yeah, well, so at the end of 2 years, I'll decide what I want to do.
We will miss you. They will miss you from the DHB, Tom.
I think they replaced me yesterday. How's that?
Who with? Who with?
Oh, actually, well, no, Sarah, did you meet Sarah Mary? I think you've been an email.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I've seen the emails from her.
Sarah's taking over the health of older people. And Sarah's excellent. She's
okay, great.
She's very good. So she's taking the health of older people work, and there's someone else coming on to because Sarah was employed a few months ago. Someone's just got employed yesterday, I think.
Hi, Tom.
Okay, that's cool.
Hi, Bruce.
I'll mute now.
Would you like us to video this and turn it into a YouTube link? I mean, is it something you'd like as a resource?
Yeah, sure, if it's easy enough to do.
Okay, we can do that. So I think it's recording now. Just make sure you look at the camera. You're looking slightly away.
I'm just having trouble.
Have you got the share?
Am I in the camera? I can't even see myself for some reason.
Turn your video on, perhaps. Or click the gallery view at the top right-hand thing there.
So, yeah, you're in the Zoom meeting. Sometimes you have to go back to the Zoom meeting. You get tricked by being in your slides and not in your Zoom meeting.
Yeah, so I'm not quite sure. How do I do
that?
So
go down the bottom.
We can see you, Tom, don't worry.
We see you, so your video is on, but I think you have to go up to the gallery view there and put speaker view on. Click on the one that looks like a Rubik cube, I think.
I don't think he's in the Zoom meeting though.
If you go down to the bottom of the screen, there should be the Zoom app, little blue video recorder down the very bottom.
Yeah.
On your taskbar thing on the bottom.
Yeah, when I click on my taskbar, it doesn't make any difference. But there's on the top of the there's a little on the top. I've got a little screen on my desktop which has got a blue box. Show thumbnail videos or show group
Michelle,
videos.
could we stop recording at the moment?
So Tom, you're already screen sharing.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Well, that's fine.
I can see your slides and I can see you. Can you see us?
I can see whoever's talking, just one of you.
Okay, so you're in speaker view. That's fine. Yeah.
So that's good. So I can see you now, Tom. Michelle, could we stop the recording now and restart it when I introduce Tom, so it looks like a clean start? Otherwise, we'll have all this chatter on first of all. So
I can see your last slide though, Tom, not the first slide.
We can't stop the recording now, but we can edit the recording once it's downloaded.
Okay.
Okay. And you can also make those full screen if you want, Tom.
Yes, I'll do that. Hang on, here we go.
And just check if you can advance the slides.
Yep.
Good. Okay, well, I will kick off, Tom, and introduce you. So welcome everybody. This is the May research seminar for the Department of General Practice and Primary Healthcare. And our guest today is one of our PhD students and is Dr. Tom Robinson, who is a public health physician at Waitemata and Auckland DHB. and he says almost retired, a bit like Royal Navy retired. So it's a bit like, so PhD student and almost retired. An interesting dichotomy there, Tom, you have to explain. Tom's doing his PhD in the department, is going to talk about the KARE program, K-A-R-E, managing, improving the management of frail patients in general practice. And Tom's been a valuable member of the department, and I've enjoyed my my time with him in the department. So, so thank you for agreeing to do this, Tom. And the floor's over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Bruce. Thanks for inviting me. So I am going to talk about the KARE project, which is a Waitemata DHB project that started in 2015, so 5 years ago now. And is still going, and we're hoping to expand. So I just want to acknowledge 3 people in particular who have been Di North, who most of you will know, I guess, who's the clinical lead of the KARE project, and of course GP. Michael Boyd, who's a dermatology nurse practitioner. I guess many of you will know Michael as well. And Martin Dawes, who's a project manager extraordinaire. And those 3 people have been absolutely key to the development and implementation of the KARE project, much more than me, really. Just also want to acknowledge the practices, and there's lots and lots of other people who've worked on KARE and been very important to KARE. So I'm just going to talk a little about the context of KARE project, where it came from, and then quite a bit about the KARE project itself, a little, and some on the methods for evaluation, and of course the outcomes. And if I have got time, and if I haven't bored you all to tears, I'll talk a little bit at the end about the success factors and the barriers to it succeeding. So yeah, so the context, well, firstly, of course, frailty is very common in older people, as we all know. And this comes from a big review article in the Lancet a few years ago, but I mean, frailty becomes extremely common as people get very old, up to 26% there. I mean, estimates do vary a lot between papers, but that's a reasonable estimate. It's also associated with adverse outcomes. And this is also from that Clegg paper. And these aren't actually confidence intervals. The paper was quoting from four large studies of frailty outcomes. And so these are the range of the outcomes from those papers. But you can see that frail people are very much more likely to have worsening disability, much more likely to end up in a care home, which is not surprising, and also have a much higher rate of mortality. Interestingly, most of the papers didn't find any increased rates of hospitalisation in people who are frail, which somewhat surprised me, and may be relevant to the outcomes that we'll get to in the end. I just put these figures in. Frail people also obviously have very high healthcare costs. This is not actually frailty, but this is American study. And if you just look at the dark blue bars at the beginning of each set, you can see that if you had 3 or more chronic conditions, then your average cost of healthcare, or your median cost of healthcare, triples. But if on top of that you have functional limitation, it triples again. So frailty, people with frailty who obviously often have chronic conditions and functional limitations can be have very high healthcare costs. What it also shows is that there's a group of that group, the small part of that group, who has extremely high healthcare costs. And I guess that ideally that's our target group, the frail people who are going to have very, very high healthcare costs and presumably poor health outcomes. Just the other piece of context was that Waitemata's always had relatively high hospital admissions, and that's particularly the case for people over the age of 75. So that was one of the drivers where this project came from over a long history. We tried a different project first to address that, and then decided we really need to work with general practice, and that's where KARE came from. So that was part of the background. Just in terms of participants, we were obviously we were aiming at frail patients. Really, this is a clinical frailty scale. We were aiming at people who had sort of mild to moderate frailty. We weren't really aiming so much at the people with severe frailty, partly because a lot of them would already be in age residential care, and also because a lot of them most people with severe frailty already have very substantial health system input, and there was a feeling from the GPs and from, that probably the KARE project probably had little extra to offer those patients. So our inclusion was anyone over the age of 75 or 65 plus for Māori and Pacific, had to be enrolled in the practice, and they had to be not in age residential care. We were aiming for GPs to enroll about 20% of their 75 plus population. And it was really up to the GPs and the team to decide who they enrolled. Just given that we said we're after frail people and people at risk of hospitalisation. We did provide them with some information about a risk score, which was the GAIN or ProCare risk score. And we also gave them some information about which of their patients had a NASC assessment. Actually, NASC assessment is very, very predictive of poor outcomes. Just the fact that you've had a NASC assessment was quite highly predictive, much more so than the risk score, actually. Initially, we had hoped to enroll all practices in one particular area, because this part of the project was about improving integration of care, and we thought that would be easier if we focused on one area. So we were trying to enroll all the practices in Whangaparoa and Orewa Silverdale area. Unfortunately, some of those practices didn't want to participate, so we ended up with a couple of practices on the shore. We also wanted to enroll one practice that was Māori practice, but Te Puna didn't want to participate because they felt they already had a very comprehensive model of care. So we ended up enrolling Kaipara, the practice out in Helensville, which had quite a large Māori population. So the participants, Whangaparoa is quite a wealthy area, and so the participants were nearly all Pākehā. Predominantly, well, a high proportion of women, as you would expect. The average age was about 82, and most people, the majority of people were living with their partner, though there were quite a proportion that were living alone, mostly living in their own home or a retirement village. About a third had some sort of support, and actually most people rated their health as pretty good, which seems to be quite common in people, older people who, despite their health problems, you generally rate their health as fairly good. And they were moderately high healthcare users, not super high actually, but certainly moderately high, higher than the people that weren't selected. And just in terms of the patients that the GP selected, we just did a comparison of the risk score of the patients they selected against the ones that who were eligible but they didn't select. And there's just a box graph there. It's just a box plot. Just shows that certainly the patients who were selected into KARE had higher risk scores, but there was a lot of overlap, and there was certainly a lot of people who weren't selected who had high risk scores. And there were certainly people who weren't selected who had NAS assessments and sometimes were highly dependent. So we don't fully understand how GPs selected them, patients. I'm sure there were a great many reasons why patients were selected or not. But certainly they were selecting a higher risk group. So a little bit about the intervention. I think people will probably be familiar with this, this description of frailty. So essentially frail people have a lower functional level and a much more closer to that line where they can become dependent quite easily. And if they have a healthcare insult, they'll drop below that line and take a lot longer to get back up. So that's the red line as compared to green line, which is non-frail people. And basically the KARE project aimed to intervene by firstly increasing that functional ability by trying to prevent those minor insults and then finally by if they did have minor insult, there was a transition component which was really aimed at trying to get people back to their normal level of care more quickly. So this is from Chris Ham and Nick Mays, and just their prescription for the a healthcare system that would work really well for people with chronic care and I think people with frailty, and they listed 10 things. And I mean, I think KARE tried to address nearly all of those things to some degree. And I guess that's not rocket science. Just about every program that's aimed at frail people in general practice has done the same thing. So the interventions are fairly well known. I guess the big problem is implementing them. What is a very complex model of care, really, or complex change. So fundamental to KARE was comprehensive geriatric assessment at entry into the program, which was led by the nurse. And then from that was developing goal setting and a care plan to go over the next year. And then the other part was a comprehensive and ongoing care, which was nurse-led, proactive, so people were asked to come back regularly and had a self-management focus, trying to improve people's abilities to manage their own illness. So it really was very much nurse-led, though the nurse was working very much as a team with the GP, but most of the contacts were with the nurse. There was, as I said, there was also a transition of care project part of it. So if people were admitted to hospital, the practices would follow those people up on discharge. I think the uptake of that was a bit variable between practices. It probably wasn't a huge part of the project, but certainly some practices were very focused on that. There were several things done to try and improve quality of care generally. There was a big focus on improving practice systems. We had both a practice nurse and a project manager who spent a lot of time assisting practices to improve their systems around care. There was quite a number of team education sessions, which were GP, practice nurse and a receptionist or practice manager attended those together usually. Some were just nurses, but mainly they were a team. There was also a GNS mentor. So each practice had a GNS specialist that worked with that practice and essentially worked with particularly with the practice nurse around management of the care patients. Not hands-on management, but assisting the practice nurse around some of those management issues. And there was IT. The IT was very fraught, I'd have to say. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But there certainly was an attempt to use IT to support better decision making, particularly towards the end of the project. So one of the problems with IT was that the DHB was very keen for us to use eShared Care Plan. I'm not sure, I'm sure many of you have had experience of that, but it essentially wasn't well received by the GPs who felt it didn't integrate well into their practice management systems. So that essentially, we spent quite a bit of time on that, but it wasn't a success. A lot of the stuff around integrated care turned up being much more around building relationships between secondary care and NGOs and the practices, and the GNSs were very fundamental to that process. There was also we had quite a lot of decision support tools which initially had to be largely paper-based, but they were very much focused around integrated care and helping practices to access care from lots of different resources. So just about outcomes. So there were about 1,100 patients in care eventually, enrolled over quite a long period, over 18 months. And it wasn't a randomized controlled trial, so the DHB wasn't keen to do a randomized controlled trial, so the evaluation was a quasi-experiment. And so essentially what we did, for every care patient, we tried to match them to 4 other patients from Waitemata practices who we thought were very similar. We identified 28 different variables across quite a number of different domains. And we use a method called propensity score matching to identify people who were very similar. So the problem with 28 variables is if you try and match on each individual variable, you'll never find anyone that's exactly the same as the patient. So you turn those 28 variables into a propensity score, which is this likelihood of being in the care program, and you match on that propensity score. And there's a lot of theory and practice behind this, but it's been shown that if you match on propensity score, then you end up with very good matching. And actually, as a group, comparison group and our care group, we're extremely similar across nearly all of those variables. We didn't quite get a match on ethnicity because it was that area so very white, European. And we didn't quite get a match on the practice size variable because that area also had very large practices. But otherwise, the 2 groups were essentially identical across the whole range of variables. In addition, so we had those 2 groups that we were comparing, but in addition, we used outcome models as well. So we controlled in our outcome models for a whole range of variables as well. So what's called a doubly robust analysis. The outcome models actually made very little difference to the outcomes, but we did do them. I mean, just be careful. I'm just going to talk about 3 different methods. Essentially, we would have liked to have done everyone using a control before and after study. And the advantage of control before and after study is that when you're comparing 2 groups that aren't randomized, the concern is always that you will end up with unknown confounders. well, you will end up with unknown confounders. I don't think there's just any doubt about that. And even though we control for 28 confounders, there are probably other confounders that we couldn't control for. For instance, just an example of that is motivation. It's quite possible that care patients are much more motivated than the patients who weren't included who were in our comparison group. And one of the ways to deal with that is to do a difference in different studies. So if there are unknown confounders, then as long as those confounders stay the same right throughout the study, then you can control for them by deducting the difference in outcomes from before the study from the difference in outcomes from after the study, and that should leave you with the true difference in outcomes that is due to the intervention. Not sure if that's clear, but that control before and after studies have been shown to be have much higher internal validity than a pure cohort study or after only study. So we used to control before and after wherever we can, which was largely around health service utilization. So, sorry, this is a very complex table, I should have taken that. But essentially, we looked at acute hospitalization, which was one of our primary outcomes. And unfortunately, there was no difference in acute hospitalization. In fact, there was a trend for the care group to have slightly higher hospitalization, but really no difference in bed days. They were very similar prior to the intervention, and the changes after were not significant. There was an increase in the use by the care group of support services, which is what we had predicted and what we wanted, because these patients were having comprehensive assessment and often being referred to therapists and for needs assessment. So both therapists and needs assessments use increased in the care group, which is what we would have wanted. District nursing didn't really change, but those two changed. And then we had some outcomes which we could only measure by a controlled after only study. And these were outcomes which obviously only occur once to people. So death and age residential care placement. So obviously they only occur once, so you can't deduct the pre-intervention outcome from the post-intervention outcome. So in these cases, you're entirely reliant on removing all the selection bias through your matching or through your outcome model, and that's always very, very difficult to be sure about. Well, you can't be sure that you've done that. You can do the best job you can, but there's always concerns that you have uncontrolled selection bias or uncontrolled confounding. So generally these studies are much more likely to be biased, and so you need to take that into account. And both age residential care placement and mortality improved in the care group over the first year, and improved quite substantially, certainly a very worthwhile improvement, and also very statistically significant. So there was a over 30% reduction in both mortality and in age residential care placement in the first year. And in the second, all these outcomes, I should have said, were measured over a 12-month period for this. Because these outcomes were uncommon and because they were one-off outcomes, we did some we did additional survival analysis because some people had been recruited much earlier than 12 months before. Some people had over 2.5 years of data. So we did some survival analysis to check what was happening after the 12 months. And in this, after the 12 months, there was no additional benefit of the CARE project. There was no sign at after 12 months of people catching up, according to the analysis, but there was no additional benefit. So the gap stayed the same. Although in the next graph, you'll see on the Kaplan-Meier survival plot, at the very end, there did seem to be a catch-up, although in the coming together of the two lines. Although having said that, there weren't that many people that had survival who had data that lasted for more than 2 years. So they were getting to quite small numbers at that stage. But certainly you suggest that there was a catch-up. And I guess you might say that, well, that's probably pretty expected. If you've got quite old, frail people, eventually they are going to die or live in aged residential care. So you can't maintain that benefit for a long period. But I think, again, just to say the numbers at that point are quite small and there's uncertainty about it. Certainly the analysis suggested that the survival model suggested that after 12 months, the outcomes were pretty much similar. Whether they stayed about where they were at a year. There was no additional benefit. There was no particular evidence of catch-up. And just finally, we did look at some other outcomes which we only had data for in the CARE group, so we had no control group. And one of the problems of, I think, with quasi-experimental studies is you often have very good data from existing health databases such as hospitalization or mortality or things like that, and you can get that on the control group as well, and you can get it over a long period of time. But more patient-centered outcomes such as quality of life and things like that, it's much more difficult to collect in the control group in a quasi-experimental study because well, we just don't have that sort of contact with the control group. So we only have a before and after approach. The problem with before and after is you're essentially making the assumption that without the intervention, the thing that you're measuring wouldn't have changed at all over the year. And of course, that's a pretty implausible assumption, really. Particularly in frail people, you may well expect that they will deteriorate. But also because if the people are being selected into an intervention because they're unwell at the time, then you will get regression to the mean, and people generally will improve without any intervention. So two reasons that your assumption that lies behind before and after studies are implausible, operating in opposite directions. I think it's very difficult to, in this sort of context, to be sure about what you're seeing in the before and after study. But we did measure some things before and after, and generally there was an improvement, or that they stayed the same. So there was improvement in things. There was improvement in pain. There was a decrease in depression, and actually there was an increase in people having difficulty with housework. Just the second column there, or third column, has another problem with this sort of outcome measure, in that you often get quite high attrition. In these cases, we got very high. We had a third of people on the second measure didn't have any data, so we got very large attrition just making the sort of analysis worse. So I'm very skeptical about these outcomes. Other people are more enthusiastic about them, but yeah, very difficult. Very difficult when you can't get data from a control group. So just briefly about success factors for the project. I think the KARE project was quite a complex intervention that required quite a lot of behaviour change management, and I think it was, to me, it seemed very successful in that. And just talking about project management first, it was well resourced compared to many interventions that happen in DHB. The change management had a very good team that were resourced to spend quite a lot of time on it, and that was absolutely crucial. I think we also had a very good team. I mean, Di and Michael are both very good at influencing people and are really good opinion leaders and were ideal people for a project like this. And Martin's an excellent project manager. So I think we did have a very good team, and they were resourced to spend time on it, and that was absolutely crucial. And I think that, on the other hand, that is one of the problems with the project, is that it would be very difficult to replicate that on rollout to the degree that we did. Now, some of that time was obviously in developing a new project, but a lot of it is working with practice teams. So another advantage we had was that we've had a long-term relationship with these practices. We've essentially now been working with them for 5 years, and the one practice dropped out, but the others are still enthusiastic and wanting to do things with us. So that's been really good. The DHB has strongly supported KARE. They've been quite enthusiastic about the project. At a practice level, I think all the practices were certainly committed to the values of the project. They all strongly believed in the need and to work with frail people and the model. They're all well engaged with that. All the practices engaged their entire team, so the practice manager, GP, and nurses, and that was really crucial. Another crucial finding was that you need to allow the implementation to vary between practices. Every practice was different. They all implemented in a slightly different way. But they all shared knowledge between practices, and they came together frequently and shared knowledge. A couple of barriers. Some practices, one particular practice was reluctant to increase the nursing time that was to the degree that was required for the project, and that was a very significant barrier. And as I mentioned, the IT has been very fraught in terms of initially trying to use a system that wasn't really well received, and then taking a very long time to develop IT to support the project, which is now very much in place or becoming in place, and it's been really helpful. But a lot of the project was done without the required IT, and that was a real barrier. Just in terms of funding, I think a real key to the project's success was that the DHB agreed to work with these practices for 10 years and fund them for 10 years. There's a real feel in general practice that DHBs come out with these pilots, and they do them for a couple of years, and the practices put a lot of resources in and give time to the projects, and then the DHB walks away from them. So there's a degree of cynicism out there from general practice. I think the fact that we managed to get the DHB to say, well, even if KARE doesn't work, we'll continue working with you around older people for 10 years and we'll guarantee the funding, was really, really helpful. And also the fact that there was funding, not just for the KARE provision, but there was funding for the practices to actually do the development work. And there was, as I said, there was a lot of funding for the project support. I think even so, Di calculated that for the average practice, Care actually only contributed probably another 2% to their funding. So it still remains a very insignificant part of their funding, which makes it hard to persuade practices to spend a huge amount of energy. You still are somewhat reliant on goodwill. I think that again is a problem that DHBs have working with practices. They do lots of small add-ons, and we really need to learn to do substantial things with practices, because there's a whole lot of stuff that doesn't fit the current general practice model, and much more fits the care model. And we could be doing a very substantial piece of work with practices, but much more difficult to do, of course. So where's it going now? We're currently trying to persuade the DHB to roll the model out, and of course that's difficult with lots of other priorities, and then COVID happened, so we're not quite sure where that is. There's always proposals when you do these models well, we'll just do a little bit of the model, the cheap part of the model, and I really don't believe that would work. People want to take the IT stuff or other bits and pieces and just put it together, implement part of it. I think if you really want something like this to work, it has to be the whole thing. So the IT has been, the other things we're doing is the IT development. We're developing a dementia care package as part of care, and the next thing on the off the blocks would be particularly to address polypharmacy. And we're spending more time with the practices around co-design with the practices, because the care project did have some co-design at the beginning, but it was largely a model that came out of the DHB, and we wanted to spend more time with the practices on the development of the care project. So thank you very much. That's the end of the presentation, and I'm certainly very happy to answer any questions. Yeah.
Okay, well, we've got the chat function, and if you want to send a question to Tom or just unmute yourself and ask a question, I might just kick off, Tom. I was interested that it was nurse-led rather than doctor-led, and I understand that, because I think nursing training probably lends itself better to that holistic thing, the medical care. But I just sort of wondered where that came from. What were the politics of that? What was the literature that supported that, or why did you go down that route?
Well, it was nurse-led, but it was certainly a team. It was always intended that it would be a team approach. I guess the fact it's nurse-led was largely because it requires quite a lot of time. You need people who can spend quite a lot of time with the patient, both in the initial assessment, which is quite comprehensive and long, and then with the follow-up. And essentially, nurses are much less expensive than GPs, of course. And also a lot of the work is very, very suited to nurses. It's managing chronic conditions, it's self-management support. In fact, one of the benefits from the practices perspective that they tell us is that it has changed the roles of nurses, and a lot of practices are seeing that nurses can take a much more active role in the sort of chronic care management approach.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think a lot of some practices are very old-fashioned in what nurses can do, and in our clinic, our nurses have various portfolios and specialties and things. So a nice question here from Janine. Thanks, Tom, really interesting. What do the changes look like for the patient? If I was a frail patient, what are the main differences I would see?
So what you would see is you would come in and you would spend an hour with the nurse just talking about your health, and a much more comprehensive assessment. both the practices and the patients have feedback that they really appreciate the comprehensiveness of the assessment. And you know, they used to, obviously they have long-term relationships with GPs, but they used to go in and talk about one or two problems, and they really appreciated being able to discuss problems in a whole range of areas and identifying all their issues and then choosing what they want to focus on. The other thing they would have noticed is a lot more contact with the nurses and regular follow-up with the nurses, both face-to-face and telephone. And that part of the care is all free, so there's no cost to the care part. They still do pay for their routine care, what would have been normal. There's much more focus on self-management in terms of the nurses trying to work with patients to be able to manage their own problems. We actually also had some group self-management course classes run as part of the CARE project, which were all very well appreciated, but like my experience with group self-management, we all know it has a very strong evidence support. It's actually really hard to get people to get along to them, and probably only 10% of the care patients went along to them. Partly that was an issue of transport, which we never really got on top of, but it's actually quite difficult to get patients to commit to, you know, 6 sessions, a couple of hours.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if that was Janine Bycroft. She might have some comments about it.
Yeah, well, I know we've tried group things in our clinic and they go well when you get the people there, but there's a lot of air traffic control to get people physically into a building on a certain time for all those reasons. We've got some more questions here, Tom. And I may just ask the speakers to unmute. Nairi, would you like to unmute and ask your question about cost?
So I just was wondering, that's a significant savings in residential care placement. Did you estimate at all the cost savings versus the cost?
Sorry, I'm having trouble hearing you.
Well, I can better.
Oh, it's because I put, that's right. Is that better?
Yes, that's good.
Yeah. Oh, you know, I put my microphone up. Okay, so it's obviously quite a significant savings in residential care placement. Did you do the costs of the intervention versus the costs of residential care placement estimate?
Yeah, we certainly looked at the costs in the first year, and in the first year it wasn't cost saving. In fact, it was still cost. It was an additional cost. We haven't looked at the second year because a lot of the savings would be in the second year and subsequent years if the age residential care difference stayed, but certainly there's a difference in the second year. I would be hopeful it would be much closer to cost neutral in the second year, but we haven't done that yet.
Okay, so do you think that the patients and the GPs were happier, better off, had better quality of life? Is there a way that you can put some kind of, I mean, obviously you're paying for improved service and increased outcomes. So is there an idea that it's an acceptable cost to improve those outcomes if there was reasonable evidence of the outcomes improving?
The project, the patients certainly really were very positive about the project. They like it a lot.
Yep.
The practices like it a lot. They find that it's a much better method of, much better model of care for managing these people. They're very enthusiastic about it. As I say, it would be fantastic to be able to measure some of those softer outcomes, soft, such as quality of life or mental health and function. But unfortunately, just because it's a quasi-experimental study, it's so difficult to get that data on a control group. So you're really stuck. And I mean, so that's a real problem. is there an acceptance in the DHB that that even if it didn't save money, it's worthwhile? I think there really is, and I certainly think the DHB has a strong belief in the project. The problem is, of course, that there's so many competing priorities, and one of the particular problems is that, of course, the DHB has had a very clear focus on reducing inequalities, and of course, health of older people projects don't generally reduce inequalities greatly, because the vast majority of older people are Pākehā, and so that's an issue. We're always competing against programs for funding that focus on Māori and Pacific and other groups. So that's a bit of an issue. I mean, clearly though, there's an appreciation that old people are increasing rapidly, and that current models of care are not good for old people. So I'm not quite sure where that's going to go, Murray. I don't know.
Got a question from Ruth K. Ruth, do you want to unmute and ask Tom?
Hello, Tom. Thank you. That was really good. I just have one question. Considering that you mentioned that there is limited resources, I'm just wondering, did you have any sense about which component of your intervention actually is a key driver, or one or two components are the key drivers that makes the difference?
It's really hard, Ruth. I mean, I think it's like a lot of these interventions, a complex intervention with multiple components, and I think they do work synergistically. I think it's really difficult to say that you can take one out and save money. I mean, clearly the major cost is in time, practitioner time, particularly nurse practitioner time, and that I mean, that's difficult to reduce the cost of that. The other substantial cost is obviously the change management, both for the practice time to change management and also for the project team. But I think that can certainly be reduced as we roll out. I think there's an opportunity because we know how to do it much better, but there's still a significant need for change management. I think that does need to be supported.
What does that look like, Tom, when you mention change management? Is that getting the practices to agree on how to do things and getting them motivated?
Yeah, so a number of things. I mean, it was giving the practice time to develop the systems in their practice. It was the team came to fairly regular educational, well, I call them educational, they were often discussion sessions. There was time for the practice nurse to spend with the geriatric nurse specialist just around discussing management problems. And then there was the project management team where Di and Martin, particularly the project manager, spent a lot of time in the practices, just working on making sure that the systems were up and working, and that we're collecting. Some of that was around the evaluation, just making sure that we could collect data, and it takes an awful lot of time to establish data collection, as I'm sure you know.
Are you able to take out the study costs as opposed to operational costs when you look at the costs?
No, we haven't done that. I could probably get Martin and Di to do an estimate of that, but we haven't quantified that.
Yeah, that would be interesting. Got a question from Yvonne Bray there. Yvonne, do you want to unmute and ask Tom?
Yeah, Tom, that was so interesting. Thank you for that. I'm coming from a background of being in practice nursing, and I know you talked about the barrier there of time for the nurses, but you know, the actual experience and skills of these nurses between practices must be very variable. Am I right?
Yes, yes, that's certainly true, Yvonne. We did, I mean, as I said, we spent quite a lot of money on upskilling, but you do need a nurse that wishes to do that. And each practice had a different way of going about it. Some practices just nominated a particular nurse who was interested and willing, and she did all the care work. Other practices tried to upskill all their nurses, and they all had a somewhat different approach. It's certainly very dependent on the nurse taking it up and being. Most of the nurses were quite enthusiastic, though.
Yeah, and what I hear from students that I speak with really is how much their actual workload enables them and empowers them to actually do more in terms of, you know, this intervention or any intervention, in fact, or spending time, even with study. They come with huge stress levels, you know, to try and take on any more study and upskilling in these areas.
Yes, well, I think that was certainly what our finding. If the practice did not purchase more nurse time, then it struggled, it really struggled, because the nurses were being asked to do an awful lot of extra stuff on top of what they'd already done.
Yes.
If the practice really got behind it and says, yes, we'll do this and we'll employ more nurse time for the care project, then that worked.
Absolutely. I would say that would affect your outcomes considerably, depending on how much the practice was allowed to enable and empower the nurses.
Yes, that was one of the key findings.
Tom, I've got a couple of questions. I was very interested in your discussion about before, after controlled trials. Could I encourage you to write a paper on that, on just the methodological issues there? Because I've often looked up trying to find examples, and actually there aren't an awful lot of examples in the literature about before, after, and whether you should do controlled or uncontrolled. And you've got a particular group here who are deteriorating with time anyway. And so you've got competing factors to show changes. So I don't know if you found a particularly good article on that, but I would be interested.
Well, part of my PhD is I did a systematic review of what's called within study comparisons, which is a study where they've done a randomized controlled trial. And generally, after they've done the randomized control trial, they've replaced the control group with an observational control group. So, and they've compared the outcomes of the RCT with the outcomes of this manufactured observational study. And I actually found, unfortunately, I found 60, which took me a lot longer than I had thought. Because, a lot of them are written by economists, and economists seem to like writing 100-page papers. So, so it took me a long time, but the results are very clear that controlled after studies have a very, very much weaker internal validity than a controlled before and after study. Or in fact, the other two sorts of studies that had strong validity are interrupted time series, and which are mainly controlled as well, or a study design called a regression discontinuity design, which I don't know if you know what that is, but that's quite often used in other sectors, not so much in health, and more in health now. So those three studies had reasonably high internal validity, although you certainly still get the occasional study which was way off, but controlled after only studies are very problematic.
Yes.
And yeah, well, it's my intention to write something about that.
Well, that's good, yeah. Well, then there's a tendency of funders just to sort of look at outcomes, isn't there, rather than before and after. They just want to look at the after. And, you know, the ministry are famous for that.
Well, I mean, I looked at evaluations done in New Zealand, and over half of the evaluations done in New Zealand are uncontrolled before and after studies.
Right.
And I think they are very often flawed, very often due to regression to the mean, and unduly optimistic.
Right.
And I think that it concerns me that there's a lot of decisions being made on those studies.
Yes, that's good. We're just about finishing here, but I've got one question. I'd be interested in the NASC study, in a sense, as a diagnostic test, isn't it? And you could do a sensitivity and specificity on that as a diagnostic test. So I'd be interested in if you wanted to have a little look at that and just see, because you said that was very predictive of outcomes, having had a NASC test.
Well, so I looked at the predictivity of the NASC versus the gain predictive risk model, which obviously a gain predictive risk model has lots of different characteristics in it. But the NASC model is much more predictive of both hospitalisation and age residential care placement, which is in some ways not surprising, really. I mean, this is a group of people who've been selected by GPs as, you know, beginning to become frail and
I guess there's that qualitative, the value of a qualitative estimate of this person needs an assessment. Well, I guess there's probably a mixture of qualitative and quantitative going on in the GP's head, and that's probably very good. But it's like a patient you send to hospital. If they stay in hospital, sending a patient to hospital as a doctor is a very good diagnostic test. It's got a very high likelihood ratio. When I look at my own data, if I decide someone needs to go to hospital. So these, we don't often think of these things as diagnostic tests. Well, Tom, I'd just like to thank you for that. Was a terrific talk, and what a terrific project. And bravo, Waitemata District Health Board for guaranteeing 10 years of funding, because that is an issue with these things. As somebody on the receiving end of these projects, as they do tend to sort of rise and fall rather quickly, and you've got data. Janine's just got one more question there. We could use the IDI data to replicate different retrospective designs and compare. Have you got a thought on that?
Well, that's an interesting idea.
Would sample sort of and simulate the designs. You could sort of take subsamples.
Well, I think the advantage of IDI data, of course, is that it potentially would cover a whole lot of areas well, so the IDI data could be used for coming up with better comparison groups is one thing. And also, obviously, it could be used at looking at a whole range of different outcomes. I mean, often when we're trying to compare two groups, you know, we're missing a whole lot of information on social data, and that's probably absolutely crucial in terms of making sure that the two groups are similar. So that would be really useful. Yeah. In terms of outcomes, it would also be really useful. As I say, one of the big problems with quasi-experimental studies is you're really stuck in terms of what outcomes you consider, and because you don't have any control over the control group, you're having to use outcomes which are in administrative data sets. So you often look at hospitalization or mortality. You can't look at other things that are really important, and it might be that some of those other things are actually in the IDI database, and that would be, I think that would be really useful, because quasi-experimental studies really drive you into looking at a specific set of outcomes, which I think is one of their big problems.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much for that. Just got a question from Alan Moffat. Alan, I might email that to Tom, your question, because we're running out of time here. Nice to have you here, Alan. Alan's the medical director from ProCare, so some big figures in your audience today, Tom. So just like to thank you very much for doing this presentation. I hope you don't retire too soon, and I look forward to having a cup of coffee when we get back to Tamaki. So thank you everybody for being on the show, and we will make a YouTube of this and send it around. Okay.
Thanks very much, Bruce. It's
over and out, Tom. Okay.
Thanks very much, Tom. It's great.
You know,
Bye-bye.
I'm certainly happy to answer your question, Alan. See you later.
Thanks, Tom. See
See
ya.
ya.